We'll get started in just a moment, just giving people a moment to join the event. Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm so pleased to welcome everyone to today's event. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm the Vice President of Research Programs here at the Stimson Center, as well as the Director of our Conventional Defense Program, which aims to reduce risk and minimize the harm associated with the global arms trade. As many of you know, that mission has not gotten any easier over the past few years, especially as the scale and scope of the conventional arms trade continues to grow, along with the number of private and public sector actors engaged in defense transfers. So in short, the international trade in conventional arms is becoming more complex. It's placing added strains on both regulators and private sector stakeholders, while adding to the risks of loss and diversion or misappropriation of defense goods. In light of these trends, many are looking to new and emerging technologies to help address these challenges and ensure a responsible and well-managed defense trade. That's why I'm really excited today to host this conversation, which represents the culmination of a year-long project that was generously funded by the government of Switzerland that looks to the potential of distributed ledger technology, or DLT, to assist governments, industry, and other stakeholders in securing, streamlining, and increasing transparency of international arms transfers. Now, I know that DLT, of which blockchain is a subset, is most famous, or maybe it's infamous, for its application in cryptocurrency. But as our brief that we will be discussing later today lays out, the technology really has enjoyed a wide and growing utility in a number of other enterprises, and helping companies ranging from food to aviation industries adjust challenges and risks in their own sectors. Stimson has long been at the forefront of research on the application of DLT for international security issues, and many of you are probably familiar with Stimson's Blockchain in Practice program. Recognizing that many of the parallels between several international security issues and the arms trade, Stimson's Conventional Defense and Blockchain in Practice programs sought to explore the challenges, the gaps, the inefficiencies in current arms control and arms management architectures, and compare them to the known benefits of DLT. And so we're so pleased to be able to share our findings in our issue brief, which is now available on the Stimson website. We'll put that link in the chat. Before I turn to my colleague, Elias, to give us a quick overview of the brief and what we found, I'm going to very briefly introduce our fantastic panel of experts who are going to help us dig into this issue and contextualize this initial research. So let me start with my colleague, Elias Youssef, who has led this project and is research analyst with our Conventional Defense Program. Elias is an expert on U.S. security cooperation and has written extensively on how the United States can strengthen risk mitigation efforts to address diversion and misuse of U.S. origin weapons. His recent research has also focused on the war in Ukraine, transparency in and public reporting on U.S. arms transfers, and assessment, monitoring, and evaluation of security cooperation initiatives. We're also very fortunate to be joined by Stimson's non-resident fellow, Cindy Vestergaard, who is among the world's foremost experts on the DLT and its industrial and national security implications or applications. Her research on applying DLT to improve safeguards around nuclear material and controlled chemicals has been hugely impactful and was indispensable in shaping the research for this project as well. If you have not already, I highly encourage you to look at some of the DLT prototypes Cindy's team has developed on these issues, both of which can be found on Stimson's website. In addition to being a non-resident fellow with Stimson, Cindy is also the Vice President of Special Projects and External Relations at Archivist. We are also joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Diederik Kops, who is a senior researcher at the Flemish Peace Institute, which is an independent research organization affiliated with the Flemish Parliament in Belgium. where he has done some incredible work on arms diversion mitigation and arms control measures. His most recent report complements our issue brief and looks at how to consider the application of technology to counter diversion of small arms and light weapons. And last, but certainly not least, we're also joined by Pierangeli Deluca, who is a program manager of the Program for Assistance for Control of Arms and Ammunition. PACAM is the acronym of the Organization of American States. She is a Brazilian lawyer and is involved in the development of IT solutions for OAS member states to optimize arms control. For instance, she's currently working on the programming of an electronic solution for export-import licensing systems, as well as a regional mechanism to facilitate communication between licensing authorities about legal transfers of firearms and ammunition. PACAM has also created software for inventory control of arms and ammunition that's being used by 15 police and armed forces in 9 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So you can see we've pulled together people with diverse backgrounds and expertise to really foster an engaging conversation on this issue. A couple of housekeeping notes before we dive in. This is a public on-the-record event. It is being recorded. The recording will be available for later for viewing and sharing with your colleagues. You can watch it now on this Zoom platform or on live stream or on Stimson's YouTube channel. We want this event to be interactive. We're very keen to engage you all in the conversation. So after a short moderated discussion with our panelists, we will open up for Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom link, and I'll do my best to pose them to our panelists during the discussion. So Elias, let me turn to you first. To get us started, can you give us a snapshot of this project, of the issue brief, what it aimed to do, and what we really learned from this research?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, and really thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to finally discuss this research with such esteemed colleagues. It's been a long time coming, so very pleased to be here. As Rachel mentioned, the core aim of this project was to explore the applicability and utility of distributed ledger technology, DLT, in supporting international arms transfer control systems and management processes. Now, I'm going to do everyone a favor and leave it to my colleague Cindy to help us understand the technical aspects of DLT, so please reserve your questions on that aspects for her. But what I can do is talk us through a bit of the approach that we took for this project, which was really rooted in developing a deeper and more granular understanding of the challenges, inefficiencies, and gaps in contemporary international arms control and transfer ecosystems that exacerbate risk in terms of mismanagement, loss, theft, or misappropriation of exported conventional arms. And then we considered how these gaps and inefficiencies align with the known technical features and benefits of DLT. So as part of that effort, we identified 5 overarching features that seem to hold true across the various arms control transfer contexts and that added complexity and challenges to the enterprise. So to run through this quickly, this included the presence of numerous stakeholders spanning various sectors and geographies, all sitting on top of their own networks and processes for managing these really complex transactions, from licensing officials to manufacturers, freight forwarders, customs officials. All of them have visibility into the transfer process, but only into discrete aspects of it. And so secondly, that leads us to, of course, discuss the generation of large volumes of sensitive data, both as a matter of commercial necessity, but also in terms of regulatory compliance. And that data reflects the imperatives, remits, and the information architectures of the various stakeholders engaged in that enterprise, right? So there's varying degrees of cross-sectoral relevance, which of course leads to my next point, complex information flows. These are essential to transacting these transfers and connecting networks of stakeholders, but they face countervailing imperatives around limiting access to information, right? Whether that's for commercial reasons or national security reasons, while at the same time needing to ensure information can move efficiently as regulatory or commercial needs dictate. So of course, next, all arms transfers ultimately involve these physical movement of sensitive goods across national boundaries, whether that's through exporting, transfer, importing states. And finally, complex overlapping control regimes at both the national and multilateral levels. So this will include not just controls or regulations imposed by sovereign states, but any number of multilateral mechanisms meant to regulate the trade in conventional arms. Think Arms Trade Treaty, UN-ROCO, or any number of the regional instruments that we know are in place today. So given all of this, it was easy to see that, in an increasingly expansive dynamic, all the things that Rachel mentioned, environment, there would be added strains on commercial and regulatory and control systems, especially when information ecosystems are siloed in the way that they are and cannot speak to each other in any automated fashion. Something we certainly found was this very manual process for sharing information. So that simply just increases the margin of error and the potential risk in any given transfer. So in this context, our initial research points to some specific benefits of DLT. First and foremost, given the need for discrete but efficient information sharing across the various stakeholder networks, DLT seems to have the potential to offer an integrated platform from which numerous actors can, transact this information, for example, in the industrial, commercial, and government sectors in near real time. And such an ecosystem with the appropriate permissions and safeguards, of course, could decrease the regulatory burdens, both for government and private sector, but also simplify reporting and data sharing processes, hopefully creating greater efficiency, which we know is an imperative, but also transparency and integrity in the information supply chains. This is especially true, we think, in terms of when things begin their physical journey in transit from exporting to importing country, and where customs officials, commercial transporting actors, and importing authorities all require efficient access to data to effectively vet, monitor, and transact shipments according to various control regimes and imperatives. There are, of course, additional potential avenues to explore, including the potential to physically track goods, which we know is very limited at the moment, using unique identifiers, think QR codes, so that they can be tracked along the chain of custody, while also enabling governments, customs, regulatory officials to access information of any particular transaction based on the physical goods in front of them. So overall, our research suggests that DLT could contribute to a harmonization of information flows between various industry, commercial, and government parties involved in these transfers, while also increasing the efficiency and transparency of national and international regulatory and reporting processes, hopefully contributing to improved compliance and the ability of authorities to track and account for the movement of conventional arms. There are, of course, always barriers to adoption for new technologies, and I'm sure there are plenty of practical questions about DLT's real-world application in this context, when the rubber hits the road, which is one of the major areas I hope we can discuss and explore today. But Rachel, with that, I'll turn back to you.
Thanks, Elias. I think that's a great segue to Cindy, who, not everyone is as immersed in DLT and what it's used for and how it's applicable. I wonder if you could give us a short overview of what DLT actually is, what makes it unique, and any examples of really how it's been used in ways that can help us understand its potential applications for arms control and management.
Sure, definitely. It is, DLT, blockchain technology, is a combination of a variety of different computer science concepts, time stamping, hashing, peer-to-peer protocols, that basically all come together in a very cool way to be able to provide an immutable ledger that can be shared across stakeholders. So no matter where they are in the world. So if everybody on the screen was in a different country, which actually most of us are, and we're sharing information, the biggest challenge to sharing that information is it's secure, and that we're actually all working from one authoritative ledger instead of working from 16 different databases and ledgers. The technology really, I think, if you look at it from a perspective of, we're so used to working in a perimeter-centric world of security, in the nuclear sector, we talk about guns, guards, gates, and making sure that you're really securing the perimeter and access controls there. But with data flows and the way that we operate in 2023, we work in remote locations, we work with different databases, and how do we make sure that everybody is working from the same information and that information is authenticated, validated, and so that you're using the most recent information. But also what DLT allows you to do is look back and see who did what when to what piece of data, so that we know back, if we're looking back 5 years, that Diedrich and Elias and Pierre actually did the right thing that they should have at that time based on the rules and regulations at that time. So that's where really DLT excels in being able to provide governance and a forensic quality auditability to the data that we're doing. So looking at some examples, for example, the when it comes to Walmart is using it to track its food. So they're looking at its entire supply chain. If there's any issues, any food safety issues, Walmart now can actually go back and find the farm within 2.2 seconds. It used to be 2 weeks before the platform was in place. So you can imagine for public health and safety issues, this would be an example of how that can be used. De Beers, when it comes to diamonds, is on track to actually have their entire supply chain, or at least most of it, by 2030. So being able to track again where diamonds are coming from. And a lot of this is also driven by the need for governance, everything to do with ESG issues, of course, blood diamonds, and making sure that that is not the case, and anything else to do with child labor and slavery, of course, as well. So there's a variety of different governance issues that can also drive an enterprise or a supply chain to move forward. And as you mentioned with the nuclear, we had done SLAFCA, which is the world's first prototype for tracking nuclear material at the national level. We did that in concert with Finland's nuclear regulatory body. And then also MATCH, which is the Monitoring and Tracking Chemicals project, which was, there's a report out there that was put forward at the OPCW, or sorry, at the convention, at the review conference for the Chemical Weapons Convention in May. And that project is also moving forward, looking at tracking dual-use chemicals, those that are covered by the Chemical Weapons Convention, and trying to reconcile the discrepancies when it comes to international trade. So those are some examples. I can tear them apart as we go further along, but I think that gives an overall gist of blockchain and some of the examples, how it can be used.
It's really more than cryptocurrency. There are real world
Much
applications here. So I'm glad we're able to share those with our audience. Diederik, I want to turn to you because in your research on international transit controls of military items, you've stressed the need to strengthen international information exchange to effectively secure legal arms transfers. So how do you think DLT could play a role in this, and what would be some of the barriers or challenges in this regard?
Thank you, Rachel, for the question. And first, let me congratulate you from Stimson and Elias in particular for the great work you've done on an impressive analysis on such a very interesting technology. I think it's highly topical, but it's also very challenging to look at how technologies can be implemented in the international arms transfer controls. I can see there was an increased attention and awareness on the need for technologies to be implemented in this sector, but at the same time, you can see there was a very limited generalized uptake of these technologies in the practice of international arms transfer controls. So we have a lot of ways to go, but I think your research offers hopefully offers a very nice incentive to really get that conversation going. Regarding the barriers, I think there are many barriers on implementing technologies of any technology in international arms transfer controls. But as you said, our research on transit controls really pointed to the issue of information sharing and cooperation between the different nodes, as you put it very nicely in your issue brief, that are involved in the reality of the international arms transfers. And I think that's a very crucial element when you look at the reality of how arms and conventional weapons are transferred from the exporter to the end user. A lot of actors are involved at different levels. And that's a crucial element, and that makes it very difficult and very challenging to get those information flows that are crucial to DLT and to get a DLT functioning effectively and efficiently, especially in the realm of arms transfers and arms transfer controls. And as I said, although the issue brief makes a very good effort to really sketch out how that reality looks like, I think in reality, it's even more messy and complex, especially when you look at the differences of the roles and responsibilities of the actors involved in how these arms are being transferred. And on the one hand, you have control authorities, export licensing authorities, customs services, law enforcement authorities, which are nationally organized, which are specific national security focus as well. On the other hand, you have these internationally organized, often internationally organized logistical service providers, each with a very specific task and each having a very specific information on the items that they're effectively being transferring. And that very complex and also very layered, multi-layered reality of the actors involved I think it poses really strong difficulties and challenges to information sharing and cooperation on that international arms value chain and transfer chain, and which seems to be a very crucial condition basically to implement DLT. And to my idea, I think there are, let's say, 3 specific elements that are real barriers and real challenges to that information sharing. And the first one, which really struck out in our study, is awareness. Awareness about the need to share information between all these different nodes. And that was a big reality and a big issue between all the different nodes. And it was really interesting to see that there is difficulties on awareness of sharing information between national export control authorities on arms transfers that are taking place, between export control authorities and exporting companies, between the exporting company and the freight forwarders that are organizing the transfer, between the freight forwarder and the carrier that's effectively transporting the items. So a lack of awareness of what information, relevant information on the characteristics and the strategic nature of the goods was often very limited and really posed difficulties in effectively controlling and sharing information on the transfer of arms. So the awareness of information sharing and the need for it is a huge issue in this specific with these specific types of items involved. And secondly, which also is a very big issue apparently, is the ability to share relevant information between all these different nodes in the value chain of conventional weapons. Especially regarding DLT, you would need digitalized databases for information to be flowing. And when you look at the international arms trade, digitalization is often not always the case, and it's a very challenging issue in this regard. But you would also need some kind of a interoperability between these databases. And although, and I think the issue brief makes it very clear, APIs can do the trick to a certain extent to link all these databases together, these data APIs should also be developed and should also be implemented by all these nodes and actors. And they should, again, be aware of the need to implement these kind of procedures and technology in their existing databases. So also the ability to share information is a huge challenge. And thirdly, and maybe the most fundamental issue that we run into is the willingness to share information, especially in the sector of the international arms trade and arms transfer control realm. That's often a very important issue because you're right in saying that DLT can strengthen transparency and integrity, but some actors might not be interested in increasing transparency and integrity regarding to arms transfers. And that could be for a variety of reasons, that they're not willing to share information, which are not necessarily related to the characteristics of technology itself, but refer to other elements related to national security or for other reasons that they're not very open to connect and to communicate on arms transfers that are taking place and share that information with other nodes, other actors in other countries, even if it's only limited access to the specific information that they would need to allow the transfer to take place. And this touches on a more fundamental issue that I think is specific to the international arms trade, is the reality of deliberate, often state-sponsored diversion of controlled military items, either through state-sponsored illicit procurement networks or after delivery at the legal end user towards unauthorized end users, be it very quickly after delivery or even after years. In those cases, DLT will have its limits, and it will be very difficult to implement and be an effective play an effective role in preventing and countering diversion efforts in that specific case. And that will, of course, put limits on the usability of DLT in international arms transfer controls. And although I think DLT can play a role, and that should be really in place, I think what's needed is a sense of realism about what it can do and what it cannot do. And that will allow for a more targeted discussion, I think, on what specific cases and at what specific times in the life cycle and for what specific items it can play a role and can be an added value in securing international arms trades and international arms transfer controls, and in what cases it cannot play that role specifically. But I think that's something that we can discuss maybe later on a little bit more in detail.
Thanks, Diederik. I think that framework of sort of awareness about the applicability, the ability to share that information, and a willingness, right? The sort of the data is only, the input is only as good as the input is. So if the input is purposefully, duplicative or nefarious in terms of its intent, right, then you're using bad data to move forward. So I wonder, Pierre, whatever the potential benefits might be, and we can talk about in detail additional benefits, we know that there are some of these practical and normative challenges that Diedrich mentioned, but also that go along with the adoption of any new technology, right? There's just a hesitancy. I mean, we were talking, we're all very comfortable with Zoom, but try and give us a new platform to hold an event on, and we all get very, very nervous about it. So from your perspective, particularly in the context of the Americas and the work that you've done to try and implement new technologies for arms transfer controls here, what do you see as some of the barriers to implementing the sorts of DLT-enabled solutions that we've identified in this project?
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning to everyone. And first of all, I'm just echo Diedrich in congratulating you and the Stimson Center and Elias for the issue paper and for bringing or shedding light to this important topic. So building on what Diedrich was mentioning, I think in terms of willingness, we can talk about some specific practical aspects to share information. There is a distrust between organizations. So it's not only the willingness to share that information, but it's also the distrust that it was built in arms control in terms of different governments or different actors or the industry. There is a lot of resistance because it's a highly politicized issue. So I think that's a barrier to share information. There's also a resistance of the operators just because of what you mentioned. It's a culture change. And we're talking about a large culture change when you're thinking that you're living paper-based systems to electronic systems and even more DLT, that there is this whole stigma with blockchain and cryptocurrency. So I think there is any culture change in big organizations, it's challenging, and especially when we're talking about a complex ecosystems with a number of actors, as Elias already mentioned. And specifically in the Americas, I think there is a lack of resources. That is another layer that adds to that. So operators, especially in the government, are overloaded. They have a number of responsibilities. There is not enough personnel to manage all these processes. And of course, when you ask them to make a big change and they have to be trained in a different system, in a new system, and understand the technology, they may just see it as another burden that they will have to add to their current responsibilities. So unless we can make a change in showing to them and raising awareness of how the technology can facilitate their work, it's really hard to convince them to make that change. And I think in the Americas particularly, we are dealing with countries that have very different situations. So on one hand, we do have a political will of a lot of governments that understand the importance of providing better controls in the overall life cycle of firearms or conventional arms, just because of the impact that the diversion and the firearms trafficking in the region has for countries. We are talking about the region with the highest homicide rate in the world, most of them perpetrated by firearms. So there is political will for a lot of these governments, but they don't have the resources. And that also, we talk about budget, financial constraints for the equipment. So a lot of these agencies are operating with paper-based systems because they don't have the funds for servers, for computers, for software. And even when we talk about international cooperation for technology, it's also challenging because of the sustainability. So you can assist a country in update all these systems to an electronic system and provide them servers, computers, software, but then how do you maintain that? Because international cooperation hardly will be long-term enough for them to receive support for maintenance of the software, licensing fees. So it's quite challenging because they cannot rely on international cooperation for that as much as they can for other processes, right? When you talk about physical security and stockpile management, they are more limited in time. So it's easier for the international community to assist countries. But with technology, not as easy as with these other processes. We also see that in the region, there are less systematization of these processes. So even in terms of paper-based, what are the roles, what are the responsibilities? There are not that many standardized operating procedures. And these would be we would have to take a step back to standardize all that before we can move on to an electronic system. And finally, I think there's also certain limitations or things that we have to be aware of in terms of the legal framework as a challenge. And that's probably not only in the region, but globally. We're talking about privacy laws in terms of security of information that may not hinder, but pose an obstacle for DLT. Like certainly the legislation would have to be modernized. So we could integrate DLT in these processes. Certain legislation in the region still demand records to be kept in paper. So then you would have like a duplication of efforts. You would have to keep the records in paper and then have someone digitize that information for the DLT. So it's certainly it's not optimal. So we would have to work to like harmonize and to update the legislation to move forward and apply technology throughout the arms control chain. And what we see is most of the countries here still using, like I said, paper-based systems. So we did a mapping through our work, specifically in terms of the licensing for export and import. And what we found out is that 52% of the countries in the Americas are still using paper-based systems, not even like an Excel sheet. I'm talking literally of books, all the information registered in papers. And so just to conceive how we would be able to digitize all of that, we would certainly have to consider, as Diederik mentioned, and be strategic of what are the best items, the best cases, the best stages, or how to make that shift.
Thanks, Mary. I think that's really helpful to not only contextualize sort of the challenges or the barriers within the region, but then how those play out sort of internationally and the challenges all governments would face in terms of, you know, legislating sort of the technology from behind, right? The technology is already there and moving faster than legislation often can. And sort of even if you have that political will, it becomes difficult for governments to find the resources or the budget to change a system that has existed for a very long time and carrying paper copies in triplicate and making sure that everyone has them. But we don't want to, DLT is not scary, but it does require sort of an investment of time, of awareness, of training of individuals. So I'm wondering, Pierre, and sort of a follow-up to the points that you just made, if you could speak to how DLT can situate itself more practically in the contemporary arms control ecosystem and what enablers we should have in mind that could help harness the potential of DLT. I don't want this to be a bad news or a doom and gloom story, but sort of what are some of the ways in which we can think about DLT moving forward in the architecture that we have?
No, certainly. And I think DLT has a lot of potential, and that's why it's very relevant to have this conversation, to have the issue paper, so we can continue like providing maybe a strategy for how we can move forward and start implementing DLT like slowly. And I think the technology itself allowing for that scale up is a benefit. So we can start in a specific stage or with certain actors and then just keep building that network. It's a quite complex ecosystem, as it was mentioned by Elias. When we think about manufacturers or even pre-manufacturers to end users, we're talking about a number of stages across regions, across different stakeholders. So we could focus in DLT in maybe certain key stages where there is more political willingness or there is more regulation. And I think the normative framework then here plays a positive role and is an enabler. So just how it is a highly regulated trade, the arms control by international agreements, conventions, regional conventions, just the national legislation that may mandate information sharing in a certain way. And that can be an enabler, as DLT would allow us to make the legislation more operational, to comply with this international obligation. So if we think about, for instance, the international trade, which is more regulated, then there are certain spaces that the DLT could allow us to have a better control as the Arms Trade Treaty demands. Or here, if we talk about the Americas, we have the Inter-American Convention Against Firearms Trafficking, CIFTA, that also requires countries to have export and import licensing systems. So we can start from there. And for instance, to give a practical example, the mechanism that we are doing, that we're developing, is a regional communication mechanism as a secure communication channel between licensing authorities of different countries. And we did a technical review process for almost 2 years with the countries just to determine what would be the requirements and how that could be feasible. And one of the things that the countries highlighted to us was the importance of having decentralized data architecture. So the fact that DLT allows us to not have that data ownership in just one hand, I think it's a big enabler to move forward with the technology, because countries and actors do have a resistance of centralized servers, and especially if we're talking about a supply chain that goes across the regions, I don't think it's feasible to think that we would have a macro system that encompasses all of that. So then DLT would be a solution, and a solution that it's more secure than the options that we have right now. So I think just the security, the reliability of the technology, the possibility of adding this encryption layer of the data can be an enabler in itself. Another enabler that we can think about is just how technology can also assist in overcoming some of those barriers for communication. We're talking about different countries with different languages. So this is a limitation, and that right now makes things way more lengthy and complicated, because you have to go through translation, authentication of documents. And if we use technology, we could right now with AI have more immediate information sharing in different languages, or even using technology to assist us in overcoming the differences between of how the data is recorded. So right now we don't have that standardized data. The data is registered in different ways in different countries. But what we saw as a solution for our mechanism is to have equivalent tables, and the technology can help us do that in a very effective way. So it works as an automatic translator, even for the same language, because sometimes countries will register the type of firearm or the serial number in a different way. So we can use that to make that that translation, and the information can flow easier. And I think another thing that can be an enabler is using incentives for collaboration with industry and the private sector. So if we think of specific niches where there is maybe more interest in streamlining the process and making it less bureaucratic, then we can use those incentives to use the industry as an ally to overcome like the budgetary deficiencies, for instance, of the government, right? So I think in the region, just as I mentioned before, the political willingness is here, and that's the biggest enabler. I think if we can show the operators how DLT in certain stages, it is feasible, like it's a process, we can move forward slowly, and how that would benefit in terms of reducing diversion, having more transparency, and also ensuring that the legal operators can access the goods in a quicker way. I think we can make the case, and we can use that as an enabler for future implementation of DLT.
Rachel.
I didn't mute. Thanks, Pierre. I think, I always like to hear universal translator, because I do feel like we're all going to be living in the Star Trek universe of the future. And I really love the idea of sort of the using the technology to foster communication between countries, different languages in a more rapid way, not just Cindy's food example from the beginning, where we can identify much more quickly cases where there may be risk, but also where we can just foster that communication and collaboration more effectively. I think, Diederik, in your latest research that you developed together with Unidir, you've also thought about using technology and how to overcome some of the challenges of implementing a new technology. So you've developed this framework for identification and assessment of potential technological solutions to counter diversion in arms transfer. So what are some of the main takeaways and lessons from your work on that topic that regards the possible use of DLT in arms transfer controls?
It's a good question. I think indeed we're looking with Unidir on how possible technologies that are out there, because there is a huge variety of technologies that is being promoted, suggested, advocated to be relevant for international arms transfer controls, making it basically very difficult to assess on a realistically basis what could be relevant to implement in the arms transfer control realm, and who would be involved in those discussions. And I think that's the reason why we decided to start from developing, let's say, a step-by-step framework, not starting from the technology itself, but starting from the reality of diversion and building on a gradual basis and an incremental basis on how to do the assessment and how to identify technologies and link it to the specific context in which these technologies would be implemented. And I think that that's a crucial step, also to be applied on DLT, because it's not a negative element in the sense that there is no technology that can accommodate everything. That cannot accommodate all types of diversion of all types of military items in all phases of the life cycle. So you have to have that realistic and targeted discussion and analysis to take place to make it a realistic assessment of what it could be. And I think basically there are maybe 4 elements that I would like to mention that could be relevant in really taking discussion on how DLT can be implemented in the international arms transfer control. At least I hope so. That could be relevant in discussion. And I think the main starting point, which is also driving our framework, is that if you would like to talk about the implementation of any technology, it should be needs driven rather than be driven by the mere availability of a technology. And this means, from our perspective, that you should start from the reality of diversion. And that's basically the aim that you're trying to work at. You're trying to prevent or counter diversion of conventional weapons. And you should look at what diversion is and how it occurs, what the main risks and methods of diversion are, and how a specific technology can really be helpful and instrumental in tackling those specific risks and methods of diversion. And doing that analysis first, before looking at the technology, might be a very interesting step. And a second phase to bring the analysis of the diversion risks and methods and the characteristics of the technology in the equation. And in that sense, that will allow you to do a more realistic assessment of what DLT can and also what it cannot do, and for what specific methods of diversion it can be implemented, and for which ones it will immediately run into its boundaries and its limitations. And related to that, and I think Peter already referred to that as well, is you need to have an item specific and a life cycle specific approach. The relevance of a certain technology to counter diversion will always be dependent on the specific items that you're looking at, and the specific life cycle phases that you're also looking at. And I think DLT will be probably more relevant for some military items and for some specific phases in the life cycle. I think it will be very specifically relevant for effective transfer, the transfer phase of items, while for other phases in the life cycle, maybe later on in the life cycle of a conventional weapon, it would be less relevant. And I think, although maybe these 2 items and these 2 remarks might seem self-evident when you look at it, they're crucial. And because deciding on what items you're talking about, which phases in the life cycle you're particularly focusing on, it will help to focus the discussion that you're having, and it will also help to identify the specific actors and stakeholders that you would like to involve in your discussion and in the process of implementing these kind of technologies, because they will have to do it. And when you do that kind of focus on items, life cycle, and diversion risks, you will be able to have that more dedicated discussion. And then maybe on a let's say the broader second element, and those are maybe the third and fourth element that I was referring to, is you would need to have a context-specific approach, in that you would have to look at the specific context in which you want to apply your technology. And you have to do that kind of broader contextual analysis of the ecosystem that a technology would be functioning in to get a more realistic assessment of what's possible and what's not possible. Now that would be on a first level more generalized analysis, but that will inevitably also will be a case-by-case assessment of a very specific technology in a specific context. Will always have specific contextual elements and contextual barriers and things that would need to be taken into account. And in that sense, a layered approach would also be crucial in discussing it. I think DLT implies to have several elements to be in place before it can effectively be rolled out. And I think it's also be stressed in the issue brief itself in order to allow for a whole of system approach to assess technologies and their application. That's a crucial step. And that what's needed is therefore first things first. You have to make sure that the non-technological and technological building blocks that are needed and are indispensable for DLT to function are there. And that's like, first and foremost, the legal building block. You would have to have national and international legislation in place on record keeping, information sharing that should be there. If that's not, actors will not always be able and obliged to share information between them. So that's a really crucial element to have before you can start thinking about implementing DLT. A second element is the infrastructural building block. Both physical and non-physical infrastructure should be there. It should be installed before you can start thinking about implementing DLT. And thirdly is the human resources building block. And that refers to the availability of staff. It refers to the training programs that you would need to have in place for people to be okay with using this kind of new technology, because people are always reluctant to change and to implement new new procedures. So you would have to train people to be confident in using the new technologies, but also to effectively implement and follow up on the distributed ledger and on possible breaches of the chain, and to act upon identification of these potential breaches. So it brings about a new way and a new structure, new protocols on working. And that's also something that you really need to take into account, and you should think about when you want to implement DLT. So I think the different topics that are discussed in the issue briefs are really relevant. They add a lot of relevant information to the discussion on how technologies can be implemented in the international arms transfer controls. And I think in the future, it would be very interesting to see how using our framework that we've been developing and bringing in the information from this issue brief in that discussion and in that framework might even help to further the discussion and see how DLT can effectively be implemented on a very specific, item-specific and diversion risk-specific manner.
Thanks, Diederik. I think that's really helpful. And it's also nice when there's synergy between work that civil society organizations are doing on a topic. You would almost think that we coordinated a little bit. So, I think Cindy, Diederik just mentioned sort of the infrastructure that's needed. And I think in other forums, you've really discussed the role of blockchain technology as a tool to bring provenance to AI data. And there's a risk of misinformation that's heightened with the rapid adoption of generative AI platforms. Particularly this year, we're seeing all sorts of examples of that. So I wonder, as we're talking about infrastructure that's needed in terms of sort of wariness about adopting technologies, can you talk about the way in which DLT might mitigate this risk?
Sure, definitely. And the rise of AI, generative AI in particular, has raised a lot of conversation about the potential for societal scale disruptions if it's not harnessed and put up guardrails and governed. And DLT brings in a governance layer in terms of access controls, the provenance, and of course, the fact that it's an immutable ledger so you can see who did what when. So for AI in particular, if we're looking at whether it be AI training data that is used, being able to demonstrate which data was used, you could add in compliance, for example, if something doesn't have a blue tick beside it already, then that would not be filtered in. And if it was, then how did that happen? And we would be able to go back and look at it. So, if we're thinking ahead to the future, it's really where, and maybe not even so much the future, it's really coming now when we're looking at the EU, for example, and the Digital Services Act and the package that is there. Provenance is something that is required for the very large online platforms and search engines that are out there to be able to demonstrate when something has been AI generated. And you can imagine in the future also, or maybe again, not the so far away future, where kind of AI will be managing like we manage our cookies. Do you want to accept cookies? Yes or no? Do you want AI generated? Yes or no? But also what's going to be more demanded is from consumers, as well as what we're going to be seeing in governance and regulations coming forward, is do you know where the data came from? So me as a consumer might say, you know what, I'm on a platform, you can't tell me where this picture comes from. It looks like a specific presidential leader in the middle of a field doing a jig. Now, is that right, or is it fake? And then how data has been modified over time. So this is something where we're looking at supply chains already and digital supply chains, where, for example, the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, put together SCIT, the supply chain integrity. Oh man, I always get it wrong. Supply chain integrity, transparency, and traceability. We're looking at specifically in providing multi-stakeholders the ability to have standards, interoperable standards that are out there to be able to provide that accountability and integrity into software supply chain systems for trustworthy operations. So now we're seeing industry standards, or industry, I should say, coming together to build an interoperable standard that can be used globally to be able to show credentials of digital supply chains. And then one other thing, and DLT is really what is being used to support that standard as well. And then lastly, also, there's the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, C2PA. That is actually a bringing together a variety of different companies and NGOs, including Adobe and others, that are looking at also providing a standard for certifying the source and history of media content. So I think we're starting to see a shift and a convergence, if you will, of technologies that are coming together to be able to provide solutions to the risks that other technologies may be presenting us. So even if the rules and regulations and governance is not in place, there already are rules and regulations and governance in place about privacy and data and how to manage it in a variety of different, whether it be national and even in some cases international fora. So where you can actually start to use DLT to implement that today. And then be able to be ahead, if you will, of all the risks and threats that are coming forward with generative AI, and particularly the pace of it.
Thanks, Elias. Before we turn to our audience questions, I know you've been listening with interest, as I have, to some of the comments that were made here about sort of contextualizing the use of DLT for arms transfers, potential challenges, potential barriers, ways to overcome them, ways to overcome the criticisms or concerns about using a new technology. I wonder, for those who have not yet read our brief, and again, I encourage you to, after this event, download the brief from our website, but I'm wondering if you can share some of the top line findings from the brief that we want the audience to walk away with in terms of the applicability, the feasibility of DLT that sort of leads us to future research going forward.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think, at a top line level, in a very broad sense, DLT, especially compared to analogous industries, and when we think about how it's been implemented in the past in other enterprises that have some of the same challenges and gaps that we know are present in the international arms transfer enterprise, has the potential to improve, enhance, and secure information management and sharing processes that are essential to international arms transfers. And in some ways, sort of ironically, address some of the anxieties that maybe the discussion of DLT evokes right away, right? There is an ability to sort of protect your information, share more discreetly. So you're both addressing that, that intent to kind of safeguard your information while allowing efficient sharing that makes the enterprise more efficient, right? And efficiency is an imperative for both governments and for industry. I think part of the issue is how is it done that still takes care of my my security imperatives, my little whether it's normative, cultural concerns that you might have about being a little bit too indiscreet in how you're sharing information. So I think a lot of that is built into the technology. But what I think about a lot from this discussion, which I think is really what leads me to think about what should come next, right? This is an issue brief. We've published it. What happens now? And I think, to me, I want our readers to walk away, and members of the audience to walk away thinking this is an issue and a technology that has a lot of promise. And again, this was a investigative exploratory research project. So I think some of the discussion that we're having now is what I hope can come next. I think it would be really interesting to have a more tailored set of conversations with a wider set of stakeholders that says, okay, we understood in this initial phase what the gaps were. Can we work now to say, how can we tailor these solutions to your particular context? Knowing that there are going to be normative cultural barriers, legal barriers, as was mentioned, I think that would be a really fascinating place to take this discussion. I want to understand in a better way what stages, what narrow applications, what broader applications we can have. And really what Diederik mentioned is starting with the context, right? What were the actual challenges? How does this work? What are the resources available? And so that the next stage would be applying this learning to the context. And I think it's good that, Diederik and I did this research separately, but we both understood that you had to start with what the problem was, not with technology, which I think is really important. I think I'd love to be able to carry those conversations forward in any future research.
Thanks. Well, I see that we already have several questions in the Q&A, and so I want to remind our audience that they can post additional questions. The first one, Diederik, is directed towards the point you made about the limitations from state-linked diversion, just because they have the means and make efforts to undermine the ledger and the tracking anyway. So again, if it's bad data in, right, we get bad data out. Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think it's on different levels that state-sponsored diversion will bring about limitations to the willingness to share information. I think states and state-sponsored networks will have the ability to circumvent the system. They will put a lot of effort in trying to circumvent it. They will also put wrong information in it. So you have garbage in, garbage out. So it becomes very difficult to follow on reality what's happening. But what I think is also a very important issue is that the chain stops at a certain time and a certain moment, of course. So, and when you look at weapons, they are durable goods. They last for a long time. So you can have a perfectly fine legal transfer from an exporter to a legal end user, but that end user, which is often a state, might want to re-export the goods and just stop. And at that time, they will inevitably stop the chain and do whatever they want with it, so they can re-export it directly to an unauthorized end user, or even after years. So that's where you can see that once the chain has stopped and the end user is having the goods in its hands, he can do whatever he wants with it, and it's up to him if he decides to continue the distributed ledger or not. And that's when you have that state-sponsored element in it that will bring a huge challenge and limitation to where the DLT can play a role. And it can, of course, play a very important role in that value chain, that transfer chain from the exporter to the end user in first instance. But in the phases afterwards, it will be much more difficult. And I think specifically in the international arms trade, regarding that element of state-sponsored diversion, that will be an important challenge in this specific context.
Thanks, Diederik. We have some export control officers watching this event today, and I think there is agreement that the barriers that you have described really make sense from their point of view. So I think that's good news that we're being reflective of reality here. There's a question for Cindy about the barriers that have been described, if they've also been observed in applying SLAFCA or MATCH prototypes. For those who don't know, that's our nuclear safeguards and our chemicals DLT prototypes. And again, both a question to Cindy and Diederik: are these barriers specific to conventional arms transfers, or are you sort of observing them throughout the weapon systems?
Awareness, ability, and willingness. So of course, stretches across any sector that you're looking at. And then in the nuclear sector, nuclear technology is a disruptive technology itself. So everything we built up around it is to make sure it doesn't get disrupted. So it is obviously a fortress, if you will, in terms of we don't change the way we do things because there are security imperatives with it. And yes, but at the same time, when we're looking at awareness, I would say, we have to talk, of course, and with SLAFCA, That was a big part of the awareness raising, bringing it to the International Atomic Energy Agency, and of course to other regulators globally that have civilian nuclear power specifically. Let's leave out the small quantities countries. And so, of course, the awareness is a big part of it, and trying to demystify, of course, DLT, divorce it from this idea that it's all cryptocurrencies. We're not talking about an atomic coin, as cool as that would be. It still wouldn't be, tokenization in terms of, you are required to share this information anyway, and how you share it really, I mean, there's not really prescriptions for it in terms of national regulations, but here's a way to be able to show that the information, of course, can be secured, authenticated, and then also addressing the insider threat issue. So the ability also stretches to what Pierre has been saying too, where if you don't have any digitization, you don't have servers, well, you're not ready for DLT yet. But that's where the movement is coming, even in the nuclear sector, is that companies and governments that have had specific requirements and facilities since the 1950s and the legacy systems that have carried forward from them are now starting to be disrupted. Many governments and enterprises themselves are saying, look, we can't work in a 1950s way anymore. It just doesn't work. It's inefficient. It's creating a lot of mistakes. So how do we use technology in terms of their upgrades? So we're seeing this happening. And I think it's kind of like jumping from the landline straight to the mobile phone. I think we're going to see probably some shifts in that, where again, that convergence of emerging technologies, as I was talking about, is becoming more of the package that, that enterprises and governments are starting to look at. In terms of willingness, and that's where awareness, of course, is a big part of it. And the willingness is something that we're seeing driving, or at least there's motivations for, whether it be AI safety, knowing what you know and how you know it, and being able to demonstrate how you know what you know and who did what, is something that also is becoming more of an imperative. So when we're looking at Slavka, for example, the motivation really is that Finland is in the process of building the world's first deep geological repository for spent fuel. So a generational, that facility will operate for 100 years as material is being emplaced underground. So long timelines, and from the government and of course also the operator and the regulator perspective is, how do we as Finland, speaking, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but if you are them, to demonstrate that what is on the books above ground reflects what is also underground, that there's confidence in those two, because once material is put underground, there's going to be no more physical inspection. I should also note that in the nuclear sector, physical inspection is something that will always be going on. There's no way to replace the technology or replace that with technology, unless, of course, it's buried underground. On match with chemicals, in some ways, I think I'm more surprised at how conservative that sector may be in comparison to nuclear. Both are very conservative, as I said, don't disrupt me technologies. But when it comes to the chemical sector, I think, of course, the volume of trade there is, nuclear is dwarfed by it. And looking at being able to provide that transparency and actually what is the volume of trade that is going on right now? What is the challenge that we're dealing with when it comes to countries like Syria, for example, and continuations of calls that there are non-compliance going on when it comes to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So again, there it's awareness, ability, and the willingness aspect. It's really everything starts with awareness, breaking down those demystifications, and that blockchain is not an elite for enabling illegal activities. What I think maybe I should end on really when it comes to this is that no matter what technology you're talking about, the technology itself is agnostic and it's an enabler. It doesn't take away, unfortunately, of all the human characteristics that we have that are bad. So whether that be diversion, if you want to divert, it doesn't matter whether we have a paper-based system or a digital system. A diverter is going to find ways to divert. But what we have then is a system where you will be able to pull out the trends more, understand what's happening, and demonstrate compliance far faster than you would in a paper-based society.
I want to follow up on that point that you made. We have a question about how DLT seems to be analogous to classified information communication systems that serve multiple users who have different levels of access. And we've seen in recent years that people who have network administrator access to such systems can be significant counterintelligence risks. So how are these risks addressed with regards to DLT and arms transfers?
So with access controls, DLT builds them in. So Rachel, you have access to a certain amount of particular information, data, or level of access. And then Dietrich, Pierre, and Elias would also have different access controls based on the organization that they're coming from, and the right to access different information based on their roles. What happens, and same thing with classified systems, but that DLT provides this in a much more quick, real-time way. So knowing what's happening inside the castle walls is just as important as trying to keep everybody out of them. And so you can never, ever have any system that is going to be 100% fortified, right? It's just the way we are, but there's always going to be an insider threat, particularly as well. We look at the technology, for example, at the company that I'm at right now with Archivist, you can see with insiders what ends up happening. So let's say an insider goes in, wants to mess with the shipment. You can go in and you've got full access. Let's call her Judy. She goes in, or malicious Mandy. She goes in and she wants to change and mess with a current shipment. It's at the gates. It's ready to go. But the volume of it has just changed. And everybody knows that's, I'm going to pick a number, 300 containers have to go, but now it says on the manifest that it's just been changed to 1,500, for example. And so everybody's racing around trying to figure out what happened. You can go in and you can see the organization that made this change. So, but malicious Mandy changes her mind. She either gets scared, realizes that this wasn't what she wanted to do, and changes it back to the original, let's say 300 containers. So on the surface, it looks fine, but when you go in, you can see that malicious Mandy made these changes, or you can see if you were another organization, which organization made those changes. It is then up to, so if I'm at another organization, I can say, go to that one and say, there's an issue, something's happened, please figure it out. That organization has to do their internal investigation as to what happened, right? I should never know malicious Mandy as another organization. There are privacy rights. She shouldn't be stalked on Facebook. So the insider threat way is a way for it to be caught right away, to know who is doing the access and fiddling with what based on the authorities that they have. So that's how it can be addressed.
So I want to follow up on that point, because Dietrich mentioned sort of the importance of the sort of all sides understanding, the exporter, the importer, knowing what's going where, and the importance of the integrity of that information. There's also end use monitoring that comes into this. We hear that a lot. And does end use monitoring actually monitor end use? I'll leave that for another discussion that Stimson Center hosts on a regular basis. But I think there is the question of sort of monitoring, if malicious Mandy puts 300, then 1,500, then 300, someone at the end needs to say it was 300 that actually came through the door. And so I think this does not, and you all can correct me if I'm wrong, this does not replace sort of human intelligence of tracking weapons shipments and making sure what is in those 300 containers actually gets to the location they are supposed to be in. So is there a way, the US uses barcodes, there's other ways, but could some aspect of a successful DLT approach look like putting, physical identifiers that are resistant to tampering on those items, so that you can really, that I don't know, negative Nancy or devious Dietrich, the devious Dietrich can't, go in once the shipment has been received and change it so that it matches what is in the manifest, even, or in the DLT, in the blockchain, versus what is actually there. So I don't know who that's a question for, but I think it's an important one to raise.
And it would show all the way through what the history is. So whoever touched a piece of data would be coming through. So it actually provides forensic quality audit trails. And again, and then the rules and regulations and the punishment and enforcement that would come from that is based on the country itself. So when you're looking at QR codes, that's certainly something that is used. RFID tags, particularly when it comes to the nuclear sector. The IAEA has specific seals, for example, on cameras that can be used. And so, I mean, everything is a layered approach, if you will, defense in depth when we're talking in the nuclear sector, to make sure that you've got those layers built in, redundancies over redundancies. And that's what DLT does here. And just on the bad data going in, again, that's also where this comes in, where, contracts would be in place. Well, and let's say it's not malicious mandate, it's just someone entered something wrong. And they said 1,000 containers have been shipped, and then the end user or the receiver says there were 300 as per the contract, right? So, I mean, there's a variety of different layers in place. And then, of course, you never go back and correct it. You just append so that you know that the history that, okay, well, humans do make mistakes, but it was corrected and here's how it was.
And if I may add on that one, I think just we have to also be mindful that paper-based systems are also successful to all those things, and maybe in a much more, like in an easier way than technology. So like the shipment, the malicious person that can be there at the port, they can also falsify a document, perhaps even easier than falsify a data set in an electronic system. And you wouldn't have that traceability of seeing who logged that data. So it would be much more, like much harder to identify who falsified that data. So I think when we talk about DLT, we also have to be mindful that there are already regulations in place that mandate that information sharing. And that information sharing right now, it's happening in other ways that maybe are not as secure as DLT. Of course, DLT is not going to solve all these problems. We still have to have like intelligence investigations to see who are the malicious players. But maybe DLT or technology as a whole can facilitate our work of oversight and identifying who are these players, right? When we're talking about like export, import license, they are already being sent across the world. Like an export officer won't authorize a transfer if they don't receive the import license. But right now it's a paper that have to be translated, that have to go through the apostilles, like process, notaries, and that also is not 100% safe. So I think it's just like these two dimensions. Technology doesn't solve everything, but neither paper, right? So we have to combine those in a way that we can have the most secure environment.
Yeah, Rachel, if I could just also hop on that, I think, in addition to discussing about how DLT can help mitigate the risks of malicious activity or address some of that, and obviously there's going to be limitations there. But I think one other way to think about it is how does it enable the good activities or the goodwill or the good faith activities that governments and stakeholders are trying to engage in, right? For every malicious Mandy, there is a good Jeffrey, or that doesn't even rhyme. But in any case, there's somebody trying to do the right thing. And one of the applications that we discuss in the brief is even just internal adjudication of a license for transfer using DLT as an ecosystem to create more efficient information sharing between a manufacturer and the licensing authority. But of course, the licensing authority can be, a hub of additional nodes, right? It may be a national security department, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a defense ministry, a national security council, and even a legislature in the case of the United States are all trying to adjudicate a decision to transfer something. So there are a number of different applications, and to Diedrich's point, you have to be very specific about where you're going to fit in some of this new technology and where it is most applicable. In the brief, just as an exercise, we gave 3 examples of how DLT could be applied, from the very specific of a licensing process to a bilateral trade relationship to something more large, something larger, more ambitious and multilateral transfer enterprise. So it really is about being context specific, but I also want to say, just to focus on where is it enabling the best practice that we know already exists, but faces sort of practical challenges.
So I think, one of the questions that we got a lot during this project, well, like, yeah, sure, it's feasible for sort of nuclear material management. There's far less of it. Yes, the stakes are very high, but when you're talking about the scale of the numbers of conventional arms that are transferred, is this actually feasible? So I guess my question to the panel is, after doing all of this research and thinking very deeply about this topic, is there feasibility for the application of DLT for conventional arms transfers? That's a simpler way of saying.
I mean, I feel like as the ostrich short. So I think the answer is yes. And to Diedrich's point and the point that everyone raised, the larger the system, the more applicable DLT is, right? I think that's one of the things that I learned from Cindy. The more nodes, the greater efficiency you're getting out of the system. But DLT can offer advantages even in narrow contexts, right? And is very adaptable and can be made to fit and tailored for certain particular elements of the enterprise, for certain stages. Obviously, as Diedrich mentioned, there may be less applicability at certain stages. So it isn't necessarily about saying, do we have to encase the entire international arms transfer enterprise of 100 and some, however many states export arms into a single ledger? I don't think that's really what we're saying here. I think what we're trying to do is identify potential gaps within current systems, architectures, future research, very specific context that we think this may be applicable, adaptable, and reasonable to address those issues within the resource constraints and the normative constraints that might exist. I don't think anybody is suggesting that we need to have every single small arms, tech transfer bit contained in a single ledger, maybe one day. But I think at this stage, we're trying to do some of that more tailored approach that I think maybe there is a lot of applicability.
I wonder if I could just contextualize this. There's one question about, could you use DLT regarding arms supplies to Ukraine? You have so many governments that are transferring weapons to Ukraine right now. Could we use DLT to improve the sequencing of arms shipments, the contributions of multiple contributors? Can we use it to guard against diversion or keep track of weapons that are going there? Is Ukraine, and maybe that's the question for future research, but is Ukraine a possible user, or is the situation in Ukraine a possible application of DLT?
I think the challenge, of course, is that Ukraine is happening right now. The issue, transfers to Ukraine are happening right now, and to try to integrate a new technology, even if in a theoretical sense, right, if we had it in place, would it have enabled more efficient information sharing and tracking and that sort of immutable ledger that allowed us all to see the provenance of various transactions, would have been quite nice. I think it might be a challenging thing to integrate on the fly in a short period of time across numerous governments. But in terms of a theoretical exercise, I would have been very curious to consider how, kind of almost, Cindy, the work that you have done is sort of placing a parallel system alongside the known system and saying how that could have worked would have been a very curious exercise. I think for me, I'm more oriented towards, how this looks like in the future rather than maybe this particular context, although it would be an interesting intellectual exercise. Cindy, I saw that you unmuted there, but.
Well, I mean, certainly, any use case is worthwhile to test, but, can you test it when it's in when the war is hot, is something. Now, nothing would stop Ukraine from, let's say, putting in a portal that would be blockchain based, and then it could track. It doesn't necessarily need to share it with everybody else, or maybe NATO has something that could be in place, for example, for its own shipments. You could see something like that. It's kind of like building the plane while it's flying when the conflict is going, but it could also be something that maybe the Ukrainian government is already looking at the variety of different ways to be able to track everything that's coming into it, to be able to support their efforts. So building a plane during in flight is actually something that happens quite a bit anyway. So maybe that is something that could be done, but I think it's certainly a use case.
Yeah, and not to be too dismissive, of course, I think there's a lot of strong research that suggests this is going to be an issue that's going to face Ukraine for many years to come. And obviously there's going to be some sort of enduring partnership between Ukraine and the West and its military backers for quite some time. So certainly something to consider in terms of the medium to long term sustainability and even strengthening the political will behind security cooperation with Ukraine. As a lot of us have talked about the importance of integrity in that transfer relationship. So maybe something to be considering over the medium and long term.
As we near the end of our time together, I want to give each of our panelists sort of a last word. So Pierre, I'm going to start with you.
Always hard to be the first one. No, thank you so much. I think this has been a very interesting conversation, and the points raised here, I think they provide kind of this roadmap or this path of how we can continue this conversation. And I think what Elias just mentioned in terms of how to move this forward, and I think we should start on mapping what are these key stages that have more potential for the DLT applicability, and what are the technologies and the databases that we already have digitized, because I think that would make it the transition a little easier, and perhaps we have to start on what's more feasible and then continue evolving from there. So to move from paper-based to DLT altogether, it may be a big shift and there is more resistance. So if we map not only the stages, but the databases, the technologies, the softwares that are already being implemented by the actors, that they already have trust on these softwares, and then how we can use DLT to connect these databases, like it may be a good first step. And then work on the legislation side. I think like the awareness is also very important to include the legislative branch and who are working on that environment, because sometimes we just focus on the operational level, but I think the legislation, as we saw, can be a challenge or an enabler, and we have to work to like change or adapt the legislation to be this enabler, where the legislation would have all the requirements for information sharing, would also be aligned and allow for the use of technology for those transfers. And that works like in the national level, but also on the regional and the international level. We have to continue having these debates in the framework of the conventions, the treaties, of how DLT can be used to implement some of these obligations. So I think those are my two like positive messages of how we can move forward. But thank you again for this like first discussion. I think it's been really enlightening.
Thanks, Pierre. Those are really, really helpful comments. Diederik, over to you.
Yeah, well, I can only second what Pierre was saying. I think we had a very interesting discussion on this highly relevant technology, and I think and I hope it's not the end. It's just the beginning of a discussion to think more realistically about how technologies in general, and I think DLT in particular, can play a specific role in international arms transfer controls. And I hope that this discussion and this report can also contribute to having that more dedicated discussion. And I think having that more realistic, dedicated, and specific discussion can also help to reduce skepticism among the various actors that are involved in that broad realm on talking about technologies, and to reduce that fear of change and fear of new technologies to be implemented. If you focus it on specific solutions and target it to specific problems, that can help to really reduce that kind of fear of talking about how new technologies can help to strengthen their efforts.
Thanks, Diederik, and we look forward to working with you in future iterations of this work. Cindy.
I completely agree with Pierre and Diederik, where keeping the conversation going, but really testing it to be able to demonstrate. So doing proof of concepts, and for example, with Pierre's roadmap, bringing the actors together that already are at a place where that they can test this, so that there are already a digitization in place, for example, and a motivation to want to be able to use it, and then we can test it, develop prototypes, have people play with it and engage with it, and then realize, as you said earlier, Rachel, a DLT is not so scary.
And I hope after this conversation, DLT for conventional arms transfers is not so scary. So hopefully you've had a double effect. Elias, last word to you.
Well, obviously, I think I'll just follow the trend and agree with everyone. This was a great conversation. If anything, I have a greater appetite to dig into some of the questions that we raised. I think the only thing to say is I'm very grateful to our panelists, of course, and then just to say the number of individuals in government, private sector, and civil society that contributed to the brief. Huge thanks to you. I really look forward to looking at this, as Siju said, in the more, reality check way and seeing where the rubber hits the road and how this can be tailored to those specific unique contexts, doing those mapping exercises. So thank you everyone for this opportunity to discuss it.
Yes, let me just echo my thanks to our really incredible panelists. We tried a new kind of event format today without official presentations and more of a discussion and a Q&A, and I thought it was really impactful to dive a little deeper into some of the topics at hand and really understand at a granular level how this technology could be utilized. We set out to do sort of a feasibility study and to see if this was even something that we should continue to research and think about. And I think the results are resoundingly clear that there is a lot more to discuss. This is only, as Diederik said, the beginning of this conversation. It is clearly not the end. I encourage all of you to not only read the issue brief, but start identifying what are those questions that can take this issue forward. We look forward to expanding upon some of those issues and future work here at Stimson and with our partners on this call. And we really appreciate the support of a topic that sometimes might seem a little, it's not just scary, but just sort of a little bit too technological for policy folks, and to really understand how policy and technology work hand in hand to improve the situation for so many around the world. So thank you all for joining us and wishing you a great rest of your